All right, you can see my message title up there on the screen. The house of God is where God chooses to dwell. It's pretty remarkable how flippant we are in modern Christianity about the house of God. So what I want to do today is sort of give you a whirlwind tour of the house of God in history, so that we can have a better understanding, a better appreciation for what it is that God seeks, where God seeks to dwell, and whom he seeks to dwell among. Let's take our Bibles and go to Genesis chapter 4. Verse 3. How many of you you weren't at the retreat? So some of you were at the retreat, but those of you who were not at the retreat, how many of you saw the video where I taught at the retreat on the Sabbath day? Did you guys see that? Okay. Well, if you saw that video, then this passage of scripture you should already be familiar with, because I talked about it in that video. But I want to stress one of the same points that I stressed there. In verse 3, it says, "In the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of the flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell." Now, the critical phrase here in verse 3 is where it says, "in the process of time." That's not a very good translation of what the Hebrew actually says. It literally says, "at the end of the days." Now, what's the difference between "in the process of time" and "at the end of the days"? What's the difference between those phrases?
So it seems like the second one's more of a specific point in time.
That's exactly right. "In the process of time" just sort of sounds like, after a while, right? But "at the end of the days" is talking about the end of a period of time that is a special appointed time that God had made for Cain and Abel to offer their sacrifices. And we also see from this passage that God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice and he was displeased with Cain's sacrifice. How many of you think that God just, said, "Hey, at such and such a time, I want you to come and worship me and maybe bring me a little something"? Do you think that's what God said? Do you think God had already given very specific instructions about how they were to come before him, how they were to worship him? That's why he was pleased with Abel, but he was displeased with Cain, because Cain thought he had a better way of worshiping God than what God had actually prescribed. And so God was angry with Cain. It's not that Cain's offering wasn't up to the same quality as Abel's, it's that it wasn't according to the specifications that God had given. Now I want you to flip over to chapter 8 in Genesis. Verse 18. "So Noah went out and his sons," this is after the end of the flood when the ark landed. "Noah went out and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth according to their families went out of the ark. Then Noah," I want you to underline this, "then Noah built an altar to the Lord. And he took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. And the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake." Now, question. Why did Noah only offer clean animals? Why did Noah even build an altar?
It's God's specifications.
There was, from the time of Adam and Eve, God had revealed certain ways in which he wanted his people to worship him. We see that hinted at there with Cain and Abel, right? Now when we get all the way down to Noah, we see that Noah built an altar out of stone to God, and Noah then picked clean animals only and offered them as a sacrifice to God, which means Noah had a lot of knowledge already about what it was that pleased God with regard to animal sacrifices and how they were to be offered. Right? Now, the Bible doesn't give us all these specifications. It doesn't say that, in the time of Cain and Abel that God said do this, 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 and this, or here. But what we do know is that the descendants of Seth were worshipers of the one true God. They had a covenant relationship with God, because it says that Seth, when his son was born, it said Seth, this one, hoped to call to himself the name of the Lord. And it uses Yahweh, his covenantal name, there. All right, and that kind of terminology is used of the Israelites as well, and it's used of us as Christians as well, calling to ourselves the name of the Lord, that is being named after God, being the sons and daughters of God. So we see that what's sort of, we're reading between the lines a little bit, but what we see here and there through the scriptures before we get to the time of Moses is that there were prescribed ways of worshiping God. All right, now what we see here was there was the building of an altar and there was the offering of animals there. But what I want you to notice here, just as we saw with Abel, God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice. He was displeased with Cain. What we see here with Noah is that when Noah offered up clean animals to the Lord, that God was pleased with Noah's sacrifice. Right? We agree with that? I mean, after all, what we want as human beings is to please God. Right? We don't want to bring his wrath down on us. All right, let's skip down to Genesis chapter 12. Let me advance my slide here before there we go. There's Noah's altar.
Now your backyard.
In somebody's backyard with a canvas back there. Genesis chapter 12 and verses 7 and 8. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. And he moved him from there to the mountains east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Now, by the way, the word Bethel there, the place called Bethel, Moses is writing Genesis. He's not saying that the place was called Bethel when Abraham was there. Okay? It was called Bethel at the time Moses wrote it, which was many generations later. Okay? Several generations later. All right. As we'll see, because we're going to find out who named it Bethel. Does anybody know what Bethel means, by the way? In Hebrew?
Yeah.
Here, I'll help you.
Place of God. House of God.
The house of God. Okay, just to help you out there. All right. So Abraham went there and he built an altar to God. When God first made promises to him. Go to Genesis chapter 26. And verse 25. This is Isaac now. It says, "So he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well." Skip down to chapter 28. This is Jacob. Let's go to verse 11. "So he came to a certain place and stayed there all night because the sun had set, and he took one of the stones of that place and put it on at his head, and he lay down at that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your seed. Also your seed shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely The Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. Underline that, please. And this is the gate of heaven. Then Jacob arose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put at his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, and that's house of God. But the name of that city had been Luz previously. So when Abraham was there and built an altar near there, it was Luz, but it's now Bethel, only because Jacob called it that. It doesn't mean the rest of the people around him called it that. Okay. All right. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in his way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so I will come back to my father's house in peace, and the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now skip over to chapter 35. Verse 1. Then God said to Jacob, arise and go up to Bethel. This is actually 20 years later. This is after he got his first wife by trickery. Remember Leah? And then his second wife. He served Laban for 14 years for his two wives, and then he served another 6 years for his herds, and then he went back. So he's going back now. Then God said to Jacob, arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. And Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, notice this, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves and change your garments. Let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and the earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under a terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. And they journeyed. Let's skip down to verse 9. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And this is at Bethel now. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall be called Jacob, shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your loins. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac I give to you, and to your descendants after you I will give this land. So this place, where is the house of God on earth? Where, from the time of Adam until the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where was the house of God on earth?
Place called Bethel.
What's that?
The place called Bethel.
Yes, but we don't know that it was there. Noah didn't build his altar there, right?
Church.
Where was the house of God?
It's where people gathered to honor him.
I'll go back to my sermon title. The house of God is wherever God chooses to dwell. You guys agree with that? Wherever he chooses to dwell. Well, we see that God chose to dwell in different places at different times, right? Everybody agree with that? Now, I want you to go to Exodus chapter 17. I'm sorry, so chapter 20. Chapter 20. You guys know the story of the Exodus. You know God appeared on Mount Sinai and gave Israel his law. Exodus chapter 20 is the first part of chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments, all right, that God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai. What else did God tell Moses at Mount Sinai? Besides 10 Commandments. What else? Instructions to Build a tabernacle. Instructions to build a tabernacle, right? That looks something like that. Right? But did you know that when God gave Moses the instructions to build the tabernacle, which was to be his dwelling place, that God also gave instructions with regard to alternate places of worship besides the temple? Did you know that? You look puzzled. You didn't know that. Let's look at Exodus 20. This is when he's giving the Ten Commandments. Go down to verse 21. So the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen what I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me, gods of silver or gods of gold. You shall not make for yourselves an altar." Now notice this, "an altar of earth you shall make for me." Now, is that the altar that he made at the tabernacle? No, that was made out of bronze. He says, "An altar of earth shall you make for me." That is, in place of making sacrifice places for foreign gods, I want you to make an altar of earth for me. "And you shall sacrifice on it burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen." Now notice this. You should underline this. "In every place where I record my name, I will come to you." That's something that ought to be highlighted in your Bible. "I will come to you, and I will bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it." That is, you're not to use construction equipment and things of that nature to build my altar. You just take raw stones and stack them up. That's it. Okay? No fancy cut, carved, anything like that. Just raw stone. You stack it up. You make me an altar. Now, again, this was parallel to his instructions to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a place of worship for all God's people on his appointed feasts. But there were times when people were to worship God apart from his appointed feasts. And to do that, they were to build an altar and offer their sacrifices there. But again, no construction equipment. Even, when God told them to build the temple later, Solomon was building the temple. God also gave instructions that there was to be no hewing of stone or cutting, no hammering, no chiseling. None of that stuff was to take place at the temple site, the construction site. If they were to do any kind of, machining or whatever it is that they did for the materials, it was to be done off-site and then brought to the temple, because God did not want to hear the sound of hammers or saws or chiseling or anything like that in his house. It's pretty interesting. All right, but anyway, let's move along. Let's go down to actually, let me go here. You may remember that David had it in his heart. This is many years later, after they entered into the promised land, and they had the tabernacle was kind of neglected for quite a while, right? Israel sort of neglected the house of God. And David had it in his heart to build God a permanent structure, because the tabernacle was not a permanent structure, was it? Tabernacle was intended to be taken down and moved and put up again, taken kind of like our tent that we have for the retreat. You have to take it all down, and what a hassle that is, let me tell you. Take it all down, move it and put it all back up again. In fact, Diane and I we were joking about how many of you have seen that videos that some of the guys were passing around at the fellowships that of these bodybuilders. I think it was a commercial where the bodybuilders and the guy's big husky guy, and he goes, "We pick things up, and I pick things up, I put them down." That's all he does. I pick things up, I put them down. He's just weightlifting, right? That's his whole life. So Diane and I were talking about what we do to get ready for the retreat, and for us, it's we take things out and put them back. And that's pretty much our for 2 months ahead of time and 2 months afterward. Well, not 2 months, 3 weeks afterwards. But anyway, why did I even bring that up? All right. I want you to let me ask you something. When God told Moses to build the tabernacle in the wilderness, did God give Moses very specific specifications for his house? Yes. In fact, he said a couple of times, see to it that you do everything according to the pattern that was shown to you in the holy mountain, that is on Mount Sinai, right? Everything according to the pattern. Now, what I want you to notice is as we work our way through history, is that this statement applies from the very beginning. This is why Cain's sacrifice was not accepted before God, but Abel's was. This is why Noah offered only clean animals on the altar and not unclean animals. All right? God had very specific instructions. Now, when David, much later after the tabernacle, when David had it in his heart to build a permanent structure, a permanent house for God, and God gave him permission to do that, but he said, you can do it. You can't do it because you have blood on your hands, right? Your son Solomon is going to do it. But you know what David did? David accumulated all of the materials that were going to be needed to build it. But did you know that God gave David the plans and the specifications for Solomon's temple? All right, the Bible says that God gave David all the plans, and David laid everything out on paper. Not really paper, they used some kind of parchment. But he laid everything out, all the specifications, all the plans for his son Solomon to follow when he built the temple, which was much more elaborate than the house of God that Moses built. All right? But it was according to the pattern that God gave. Did you know that even with Solomon's temple, even back in the time of David, before Solomon's temple, that there was still an alternate way of worshiping God besides the temple? Did you guys know that? Didn't know that. Go to Psalm chapter 74. This is a very interesting psalm. It's a psalm of Asaph. Asaph was one of the head musicians under David that was put in charge. He was a Levite priest, and he was put in charge of the music at the temple. At the tabernacle that David built to temporarily house the Ark of the Covenant. In Psalm 74, it's a song, but it's a prophetic psalm. It's prophesying of the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's temple that hadn't even been built yet. All right, which happened under Nebuchadnezzar. But if you look at verse 8, in this prophecy about Jerusalem's destruction, it says, they said in their hearts, let us destroy them altogether. That is Nebuchadnezzar and his armies. Let us destroy them altogether. They have burned up all the meeting places of God in the land. Oh. They didn't just break down the temple. It says they have destroyed all the meeting places of God. Which tells us that even as far back as David's day, when Asaph prophesied this, or at least by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which was about 500 years later, there were other places, other meeting places, where the Israelites worshiped God besides in Solomon's temple. There were places throughout the land. By the way, this is according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, this statement here in this psalm is a reference to what we might call proto-synagogues. You're familiar with synagogues. Synagogues were meeting places where people came together to pray to God and to worship God in song or whatever, okay? And the Jews had this even apart from the temple. Now, one of the things that we think of, if you hear the word synagogue, what do you think of?
Parish church.
What's that? A Jewish church?
A church.
Do you think of a building? Looks sort of like a church, but there's no cross. Got a Star of David on it or something like that, right? The word synagogue does not mean a building or a structure. The word synagogue has almost the exact same meaning as the word ecclesia, the assembly. It's talking about, it comes from the preposition sun, which means together. And it literally means to assemble together. That's what it means. So, in the beginning, a synagogue was an assembly of people. It had nothing to do with a building. All right, now, where did the buildings come from? Where did all that come from? First of all, this is, I just grabbed the picture off the internet, but synagogue was almost certainly places in homes where people met to worship God. They didn't have dedicated buildings for that until after the Babylonian exile. Now, during the exile, synagogues became very valuable to the people of Israel. That is, those who truly wanted to worship God. Why was that?
Yeah, they couldn't worship in the temple.
There was no more temple, right? Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, and they were carried off. The priests couldn't function as priests because they didn't have their altar, right? They couldn't go through the rituals because it required the temple. So they were left with what? What were the Jews left with regard to worship?
Synagogue, in-home synagogues and underground synagogues.
And they met on the Sabbath day because the Sabbath day was the day that people could set aside for God that didn't require priests, a priesthood, a building, or any of those things. You could honor God on the Sabbath and meet together and gather together. Where? Outside. You could go at the park. You could go under a tree, right? Anywhere. You could do that. And so the idea of synagogue became very, very valuable to the Israelites during the Babylonian exile. But after the exile, when Cyrus gave the decree to go back and rebuild the city and the temple and all that stuff, a lot of the Jews did, and they were devoted to the temple, and they built that, and they started temple worship again. But there were a lot of Jews who did not return from the exile. A lot of them did not come back. They were content to live in foreign lands without a temple. And those Jews who settled amongst the pagans all over the world, the known world, at the time, were content not to go to Jerusalem to keep the festivals or really do much of anything with regard to temple worship. Now, some of them made the trip, but most did not. And so what did they do instead? They built elaborate structures in place of the temple, and the term synagogue then was applied to the structures. It was the meeting place to worship God. You see, it started with a necessity because the temple was destroyed, or during times between the festivals they could worship God. It ended up being a replacement for what God had established with temple worship. And so what we see happening was all throughout, the area of Babylon, Persia, and then back, all the way through Turkey even. We had little Jewish settlements, people settling down living amongst the pagans and having synagogues, structures in place of the temple worship. Now, when we come to Jesus' day, there were lots of synagogues. In fact, throughout the Gospels, we see many accounts of synagogues. Jesus went into the synagogue in Luke chapter 4. We're not going to turn there now. But in Luke chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, it says that Jesus went into a synagogue in Nazareth, and it said he actually stood up to read. And he did the reading at the synagogue. But you know, one of the things that struck me when I look at the synagogues in Jesus' day is that without exception, they rejected Christ. They rejected it. There was no synagogue that we hear about in the Gospels that embraced Christ. He was allowed to teach on a few occasions, and then they ran him out of town. Right? This is how it went. The same thing happened with the apostles, you know, when they went to preach in the synagogues. They were tolerated for a little while, and then they were ejected. That's interesting. Well, what about when the apostles now are going out, they're preaching the gospel, people are being converted to Christ? What form of worship did they establish from the very beginning? Let's go to Acts chapter 2. Verse 46. You guys know that the Acts 2, it's Peter's sermon, and then 3,000 people are baptized by Peter and the other apostles. And let's go down to verse 46. It says, "So continuing daily with one accord," now notice this, "in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the assembly daily those who were being saved." Where did they worship, first of all? Where did they worship? What's that? And in the temple. They continued to meet at the temple. Now the temple had, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the temple was not just the main structure. It had many other buildings. It had porticos. It had these big covered areas with just had columns. All right, and so people could gather on the temple grounds in groups, and they did that. And so the assembly in Jerusalem, they continued to meet as a big group. They went up to the temple grounds, and they would meet there until they finally got thrown out of there. But also, they were meeting from house to house. And literally, the text says, according to house. Okay? According to house. Go to chapter 8 of Acts. Verse 3. "As for Saul, he made havoc of the church or assembly, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison." So what's he doing? He's busting up house churches. He's busting up meeting places where the early Christians were gathering together for worship. And he is bringing guards with him or whatever, and they're arresting people and dragging them out of houses because they were meeting in houses. Now, we're going to go through a bunch of scriptures here real quick. And I just want to make one point, and this is my point. The only precedent we have in the entire Bible for Christians gathering to worship is in houses. It's the only precedent we have. There is no dedicated buildings. All right, let's look at some of these. Go to Acts chapter 12, verse 12. "So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying." Now this was Peter was cast into prison. He was arrested and thrown into prison. And so where did they gather together for their prayer meeting? at the house of Mary. All right, Acts 16, verse 40. This is when Paul established the local assembly in Philippi, and then there was Lydia and her household were converted, and then the Philippian jailer and his household was converted. Where did this church, this new church or assembly, gather? In chapter 16, verse 40, what does it say? So they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia, and when they had seen the brethren. Now, when it says the brethren, it's talking about the whole assembly. They met in Lydia's house. Look at Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 5. Now, when they had passed through they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of devout Greeks. Now, when it says devout Greeks, that means these were Greeks who had converted to Judaism and were members of the synagogue. Okay? And not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas, but the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace and gathered a mob, set all the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. Now, why are they attacking the house of Jason?
That's where they're meeting people.
Yeah. The people who had separated from the synagogue were meeting in the house of Jason. All right. Now go to chapter 18, verse 7. And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus. He departed from a synagogue, okay? This is in Corinth now. And the Corinthian synagogue rejected Paul and his message, so it says he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. So Paul is entering, when it says he entered into this house, it doesn't mean he just walked over there. It means he went over there, and that's where he continued his ministry. All right, he continued to teach. The Corinthian church was educated and taught in the house of Justus. Chapter 20 of Acts, verse 17. From Miletus he set to Ephesus and called for the elders of the church. And when they had come to him, he said to them, "You know that from the first day I came to Asia, in what manner I always lived among you, serving the Lord with all humility and many tears and trials which happened to me by the plotting of the Jews, how I kept back nothing that was helpful, but proclaimed it to you and taught publicly and from house to house." Again, they were gathering in homes. And so Paul would go to the various houses where the Christians were gathering, and that's where he did his teaching, in their homes. All right, go to Romans chapter 16. Don't worry, I'm not going to belabor this too much longer. Verse 3. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the assemblies of the Gentiles. Likewise, greet the assembly that is in their house. Greet my beloved, and then he goes on to list other people's names. Again, the assembly met in their home, in the home of Priscilla and Aquila. 1 Corinthians 16:19. The churches or assemblies of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord with the assembly that is in their house. So again, we have the same reference to the home assembly there. Colossians chapter 4, verse 15. I'm almost done with my list. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, and Nymphas and the assembly that is in his house. And also in Philemon chapter 1, verse 2, we learned that there was another assembly in Laodicea besides that one. Chapter 1, verse 2. To the beloved Ephia, Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the assembly in your house. Again, all right. Now, that's just sort of a survey of the different New Testament assemblies, every one of which, as far as we know, was meeting in homes of Christians. Every one. There is no exception. There is no example. There is no instructions to build a big synagogue for Christian worship. There is none. Now, does that make it wrong? Not necessarily. Doesn't make it wrong. Well, how did we go from, during the entire time of the apostles, and even afterwards, meeting only in homes, how did we get from that to what we see in Christianity today? Which is all these big churches that sit empty all week long, that cost thousands and in many cases millions of dollars to build, and sit there empty all week long except for 1 or 2 days when somebody's there for an hour or two. How did we get from that to this?
I'd say the Catholic. Yeah.
Catholic Church. We blame everything on the Catholics.
Centralization, right? It's a hell of a lot easier to control what's being taught and how things are being practiced if you centralize the location.
Catholic.
I think that they tried to mimic the synagogues and the priesthood.
They did. They did that. But there was a guy named Constantine who supposedly, Stephen gets a gold star.
I was going to say, where's my gold star?
There was a guy named Constantine. Now there were other houses of worship before Constantine, okay? There were people sort of following the pattern that the Jews did with synagogues, all right, where they had dedicated buildings. And so there were some Christian assemblies that built dedicated buildings, but they were just typically like a converted house or something like that, all right? They didn't build big, elaborate things. Constantine comes along and he's going to make Christianity, sort of not necessarily the official religion of Rome, but sort of the religion that was held in highest regard by the Roman government. All right? Constantine ended Christian persecution. See, while all the way up until the time of Constantine, from the time of Christ all the way up till Constantine, which you can say at about AD 325, Christians were persecuted in wave after wave after wave of persecution. So, do you think they had big elaborate church buildings? No, because that's the first target of persecution, would be to burn down the church building, right? And when the government is against you and the government has outlawed your faith, you're not buying property and putting up big fancy buildings, okay? It just doesn't happen. But when Constantine came along and he claimed to have a conversion experience, which he did for political advantage, by the way, because Christianity had spread so big and he wanted to unite his empire, and there were so many Christians all over the empire, he decided to make Christianity the favored religion. He abolished persecution of Christians. And what does he do? He sets out to build cathedrals, what we would call cathedrals. That is, huge, elaborate buildings dedicated supposedly to God and to Christianity. But in reality, first of all, does anybody know what the word cathedral means in Latin? It's a Latin term.
It's somewhere back there, I think.
It means the bishop's throne. The bishop's throne. The bishop is pastor, same thing. The bishop's throne. How many of you look at this church here, this building, as the pastor's throne? What does that even imply?
Well, the pastor.
It implies somebody being elevated to this, up on a pedestal like the Pope, right? Is that the structure for Christ's assemblies that Christ established? Why not? What did he say? He said, don't call anyone on earth rabbi, because one is your teacher, right? Christ. Don't call anyone father as a title, not as your own father, but as a title, because one is your father, God who's in heaven, right? He says, basically what he did was he forbid taking titles of honor to those who were tasked with doing the teaching or whatever in his assembly. Why did he do that? He said, because you are all brothers. We are all equal in God's sight. Just because somebody has the gift of teaching, or somebody might have another gift or something as a function in the assembly, it's because we are just one cog in the wheel. That's all. And we're not to be elevated above everyone else. What did Constantine do? You know what he did? He elevated the bishop in the church in Rome, the assembly in Rome, to be some guy on a pedestal, some guy who had almost the same kind of honor, second only to the emperor himself of the entire Roman Empire. This is how the whole papacy, the popes and all that kind of stuff got started. It was by elevating the bishop in Rome, and he only chose Rome because Rome was his capital. I mean, it was the capital of the empire. And so the church in Rome then became sort of, the mother church, even though the Jerusalem church was technically the mother church, really, not Rome. Anyway, that's how that started. And then, of course, the Catholics have built these cathedrals all down through the centuries. And then, we come to the time of the Protestant Reformation. We had a lot of denominations broke off from the Catholic Church, but they simply took a lot of traditions with them. And these big, elaborate, so-called houses of worship, there's nothing anywhere in the Bible where God instructed Christians to do that. There's no example of any authority by the apostles or anybody else of that being done for the worship of God. Nowhere. And the only case we have that's similar to that, which is the synagogues. The synagogues were built as a replacement for going to Jerusalem to worship God. Secondly, when Jesus went into the synagogues to preach and to teach, they all rejected him. When the Apostle Paul went into the synagogues to teach and to preach, they all threw him out. And he took people and brought them into homes. That's the only precedent we have. All right? Now, again, I'm not saying that it's wrong to have a building. I'm not saying that, because I don't think it is wrong to have a building. What I'm saying is, there is no case where God has commanded that. Now, yes, Kathy, you were going to say something?
I was just going to ask, so does that mean that the churches that Jesus addressed in Revelation were also home churches?
Yes, they were all home assemblies, yes.
And the big ones, like, kind of thing?
There were, okay, what happened was when a church assembly grew so large that they couldn't meet in a home, they split and met in more than one home.
And theoretically, there would have been a qualified teacher to go lead that other.
Yes, and the teacher would travel from house to house. He didn't have to be there all the time for worship, but the instructions and the elders were elders of the assemblies in a particular city. So as they grew, they multiplied, and they had many assemblies, meeting, as it says, from house to house, all right, in many different houses. Now, what they did is on special occasions, they would all try to come together someplace, right? But usually that would probably was outside, or if they could rent a place or whatever, they might have done that. But generally, their regular worship was in homes, always, yes.
I'm trying to imagine here, like in Acts, when it said that 5,000 were added to their number, that giant event, imagine, okay, where are we all going to meet?
Yeah.
Like, 5,000, that was just talking about the men, that didn't include women and children.
Yes, and up to that point, keep in mind that up to that point, the temple was still standing.
Right.
And so all through the book of Acts, the temple was still standing. And so in Acts 2, it says that they met at the temple and from house to house. So they were doing both. So what they were doing, no doubt, was they were having what we might call small group meetings, right? They would have people in various houses all over the city of Jerusalem for their regular worship. At the time of the festivals, no doubt, they all went up to the temple and met together at the temple as a group. All right, as all the Christians in the city of Jerusalem, right? And that's how it was done. Now, again, there's no instructions that say you must do it that way. All right, so I want to be clear that we're not condemning something else. But what I'm saying is that God seems to have a pattern, right? When you start at the beginning and you look, if you go all the way back to Exodus, where God is giving instructions for building an altar. And he tells them very specifically how to do that. And he says, I will come to you. That's interesting. I will come to you. Actually, look at Ephesians real quick. And I'll be done here in just a second. Look at Ephesians chapter 2. After the temple was destroyed, and also all the assemblies among the Gentiles, they didn't have a temple to go to, right? There was no more a temple. Ephesians chapter 2, let's start in verse 17. And he, and that's referring to Christ in the previous verses, he came and preached peace to you who were afar off and to those who were near. Far off were the Gentiles and near. Did Jesus preach to non-Jews? Does it say he did?
Sometimes.
Well,
Yes.
Samaritan, but that was they were
They were non-Jews. They were non-Jews technically. He preached to the Samaritan woman, and then she gathered the whole town, right? And then it was on that occasion that Jesus used that to tell his disciples. He said, look at the fields, because there were wheat fields out. He says, look at the fields. They're all white, ready to harvest. And then he talked about him sending forth his servants into the field to harvest. And he was talking about his apostles going out into the field for this harvest. Now, when it says he came and preached peace to you who are far off and those who are near, he's talking about Christ specifically, but he's also talking about the extension of Christ's ministry through his apostles, right? Because he sent them out into all the world to preach the gospel, right? So then he says, verse 18, for through him we both have access by one Spirit or breath to the Father. Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, that is you Gentiles, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit, or in the breath. Now, I taught a whole module on the local assembly, and we talked a lot in that module about God coming to dwell in the assembly, right? When we meet together, the assembly is the place where God comes and chooses to dwell. Whether it's in this building or it's in a home, it's the people that he's interested in more so than the structure, right? Right. It's our hearts and our minds. All right. Also, in where did I put that? In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. You can jot it down. We're not going to go there now. But he calls the assembly the house of God. The assembly is the house of God. Not the building. The assembly of people is the house of God. Now, let me ask you this. I mentioned earlier that throughout the entire time of persecution of Christians, they met in homes. From the time of the apostles, almost exclusively in homes, until we get up to the time of Constantine, when the persecution stopped. Then they start building all these big elaborate structures, right? Did God choose to dwell there?
He can choose to dwell wherever he wants.
Where does he choose to dwell?
Where there's two or three gathered.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's a little more specific than that.
Two or more gathered together in my name.
And people,
Yeah.
What if there are two or more gathered together in his name, but they're fighting with one another?
To worship.
Well, if you're
So
gathered
under his
in his name,
conditions.
there's unity.
God chooses to dwell where people are seeking him and seeking his presence, right? That's where he chooses to dwell. Where people are obedient to him and where people love him and want him and invite him to be in their presence. That's where he comes to dwell. It's not just because you build some elaborate structure that you spent millions of dollars on and it looks really cool. That doesn't impress God, because he's looking at the hearts of his people. That's what impresses God, right? Now, what are the let me ask you this. Why did the apostles not tell them to go build a big building? Did they have money? Did they?
No, but there's a lot of people.
They did have money.
Well,
Well, let's not go off on something. Here, let me stay with my question. Did the early Christians have money? Did they have enough money? Did they have enough money to build a building? We know that from Acts because we know that there were people who had many different lands and so forth, and they sold the land and they brought the money to the apostles so that they could provide for those who were less fortunate in the assembly. So did they have money? Could they have raised money and put up a building dedicated to the worship of God?
could have, yes.
They could have, but they didn't.
No.
They didn't. They never did. Okay? Let me ask you this. What is the advantage? Just think of your life as a Christian. You've gone to church, you know, many of you have gone to church most of your life, or a lot of your life, okay? And so we're used to that kind of tradition. What is the advantage of meeting in homes as opposed to what we are so used to from our childhood up? What is the advantage?
you could take your wealth and spread it out
Okay.
or help others.
Okay, number one thing is the cost. The cost of having property, a dedicated building that's not used most of the time. You got, churches have mortgages, churches have insurance, churches have enormous maintenance bills, groundskeeping bills. It all adds up. It's a lot of money, okay? All that money gets sucked into a building that sits there empty most of the time. It's nice, and it's a cool place to go, right? It's comfortable, and we got a big giant screen on the wall. But is it cost effective? Okay, that's the first question. What else? What else? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking that if you have smaller groups, then the interaction of the word might be more, back and forth instead of some guy up there just preaching.
Okay, I like that. When you go to church, now this church is different because we have a conversation, right? Or we try to have a conversation. But that's unique. It's not the norm. If you go to a church, what happens? A guy stands up on a podium and he talks down to you, right? He tells you what you need to know and how you should live. And if you have a question, no, there's none of this, right? There's none of that, or shouting out a question or any of that. That's not allowed, right? It's a monologue. It's not a dialogue. In a home where people are sitting around on chairs and in sofas and stuff like that, what happens?
Relax.
Dialogue happens. Dialogue. Which do you think is better for learning? Okay, how many of you are alert right now and are listening to what I'm saying? How many of you have sat in church like this? Besides Kyle.
One more piece to that is when you do ask questions in the church, and I've been guilty of this, it's going against what they're teaching, what they're preaching, what their agenda is. So that's another reason they don't want to hear
Okay.
from the audience.
What does that do though?
That,
It locks you in to your denominational teaching. It doesn't allow you to expand beyond that. It doesn't allow you to test anything. You're not allowed to test anything. But what does the Bible says? Test all things, hold fast to that which is good. Everything should be on the table to be tested. Everything. Including what the pastor says. It should be open to being tested and challenged by the Scriptures. The Scriptures is the authority for us, right? Well, not only that, people in this kind of a setting, people typically don't have the opportunities to use their gifts and their abilities. There's just one guy standing up at the front, exercising his gifts and abilities. Now there's a few other people, you got the music crew, you got the rock band, or whatever, using their abilities. It becomes a performance as opposed to being really what we would call corporate worship. I mean, there's so much wrong with the way Christianity is done today. It's mind-boggling. It's so different than what the earliest Christians were. What else?
Big churches just let people come and go without really connecting.
There's no accountability.
Yeah, accountability, intimacy, true fellowship.
Not only that, really being involved with what's going on in the lives of the other members. Because what do people do when they go to church? They put on their facade. You know what a facade is, right? A false front. They put on their facade, and they come to make their appearance, to have their big smile, to be all dressed nice, or whatever, to put on their show that everything's good, when on the inside, everything's a mess. And they've been fighting with their wife all the way to church, or the kids are a mess, or whatever it is. But they come and they put on a front for everybody else to see. And then they leave and they take all the same problems home with them. And they don't actually interact. See, one of the things I love about the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave is most of his instructions in the Sermon on the Mount are how we are to relate to each other. But how in the world can we even practice our faith when we put on a front, a image, and we come to church in order to maintain our image, and then we go home and we still struggle with the same problems? You see, what the home assembly did is it made people drop their false fronts. Okay? They were real with each other. They prayed together. When somebody was hurting, they prayed for one another. And it wasn't just this stiff kind of formal way of worship. It was a family. And this is the thing I really want to stress with regard to home fellowships. And this is something that really I've only come to appreciate more recently as we started a home fellowship in South Carolina. Up to that point, for the last more than 10 years, I was just preaching here. But now, I was out of my comfort zone. We having to do, and I'm an introvert. I'm not the kind of person who can easily, relate to people. You guys who know me that, right? I'm Jekyll and Hyde. When I leave the podium, I'm a totally different person. Okay, my real self comes out there. But what I found is that it becomes we consider the other members in our fellowship in South Carolina as our family. And in fact, Adam, one of the guys in our fellowship, he coined that term, familyship, which is what we call it. And we have this picture on our wall in our living room. It's framed, but we had an assembly and somebody, I think I took the picture. Everybody takes their shoes off and we come in the house, and I just took a picture of all these shoes sitting there because people are all sitting around, in their socks, with some of them on the floor with their legs folded, and people, me sitting on my sofa with my recliner out because I got to put my feet up and be comfortable, and it's a big family, and we interact with each other as a family. It's really hard to do in what we would call a modern church setting. It's really hard to do. Now, we do it here, I think, much better than most churches do. But most churches, I wouldn't go to another church besides this one. I wouldn't go to one. I just wouldn't do it. I'm so done with that whole routine. I'm just done with it. Okay, because it's just not real. It's not real. And if it's not real, I think we were talking earlier, if it's not real, you're wasting your time. You're just wasting your time. All right, so anyway, what's the point of my sermon? Well, I mean, what are we doing as a ministry besides this local assembly? We're establishing home fellowships. That's what we've been doing, and we've got them, you got a map back there on the wall with, all the other ones are home fellowships, people meeting in homes, and they're growing. People are growing. I mean, when I say growing, I don't mean exploding in numbers. I mean, people are growing in their faith, and they are excited about their faith. You see it at the retreat when people come together. They are just all over it, excited about because they're building relationships. And look, again, Christianity is not you going to a big elaborate building and going there to pray or worship God. Yeah, it might be worshiping God is part of it, but a big part of Christianity goes beyond your relationship with God. It goes to keeping Christ's commandments with regard to how we are going to relate to each other. That's really, Christianity is a horizontal thing, not just a vertical thing. All right. Home fellowships are much more conducive to that horizontal aspect of Christianity. And for that reason, I think we're doing the right thing. Let me also say that I also think that in the end times, what we see here is going to be obsolete. It's going to be obsolete. There's going to come a day when this building is not going to be, it's going to be a weight around your neck as opposed to being something that's good. All right. And it's persecution, government intrusion into what you can and can't say, what you can do, what you can't do, all that kind of stuff, because they're holding the IRS over your heads, things like that. There's coming a day when this is going to be a problem. Okay.
Even in the last couple of years, ever since they legalized the marriage, we've seen major denominations changing their position.
Yes.
And I think this is just the precursor to that time where groups like us will be persecuted and forced underground.
Yes.
And, state-sponsored church that teach what's approved are going to be okay.
Yeah. That's right. They won't be persecuted. But it would be best in those times to be under the radar. Right? To cut the strings of government intimidation and control, to cut that off, not have any intrusion in any way, and only obey Christ's commandments if that means we have to meet under a tree. Right? But we'll be faithful to God. In the end times, we have to shed a lot of the excess baggage in the end times. We're going to have to do that. All right? Okay, that's it. I know I went I said an hour and 15, and I was an hour and 15. I actually said that tongue in cheek, but it turned out to be true.